Greetings, salutations. So good to see you all yet again. I am Jay Gideon Winfrey, licensed therapist. Thank you so much for tuning in for the second episode of season 7 of Sound Mind. Thank you so much for your continued support. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you so much for the prayers, especially the prayers. Thank you so much for all that you are and all that you do, not just for the Sound Mind platform, but for all of the programming that we have here on Hope TV. So I want to go ahead and dive into this episode, which is a continuation from the last episode when we started out talking about the psychology of temptation. And we spent time extensively talking about the etymology or the origins of temptation. We also talked about the definition of temptation. And then we also talked about the occurrences of temptation, okay? So just have a quick recap because I want to make sure if you didn't see that episode, go back and watch it. But just to bring us up to speed, maybe it's just the professor in me, the collegiate teacher in me, that wants to make sure that before we move on and proceed, that we have the foundation and principles right, okay? So in the last episode, we touched on the etymology of temptation. And when we said etymology, we talked about the origins. Remember, the origin of the word temptology is Latin-based, okay? And because it's Latin-based, the Latin-based definition of temptation was based on 3 concepts. It meant to handle, test, try, okay? That's the etymology in regards to the Latin origin of the word temptation. And the actual Latin word is temptor, which is T-E-M-P-T-U-R-E, okay? So wanted to put y'all up on the etymology and give you a little flavor in terms of the Latin origins of the word temptation. But then we also went on to talk about temptation, the definition. And the definition of temptation was the act of considering or causing to consider doing something wrong or unwise, okay? So we touched on that definition. And I wanted to also make sure that we highlighted how temptation is the causing to consider something wrong or unwise. And we talked about why it was important to be particular about us identifying what our non-negotiables were in terms of what is right for us. We will stay committed to what is right, and what is unwise, we won't have anything to do with that, okay? So I wanted to make sure that we got that in the recap. But then also we touched on the 3 occurrences of temptations. And I talked about how in my 26-year career, the 3 common most themes that I've seen in therapy when people come to me over the different dynamics regarding individual therapy, group therapy, couples counseling / therapy, or marital counseling / therapy, how I've seen temptation impact and what the themes were. And those 3 themes were personal goals, relationship commitments, and our acts and responses. And we gave examples of that, okay? And then we slid right on over into the backdrop in theory, which is typically where I tell you all how this is going to be how we blend the sacred and the secular. If you don't know anything about me, let me always put this out there. I am a faith-based Christian therapist, okay? I make no apologies about it. I love God with all my heart. I believe that everything that we want to know in need instruction is in the Bible, okay? So all I basically do is I take theology and I put some psychology to it, and that's how we end up with sound mind, okay? So the backdrop in theory was based on Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, which is the temptation of Jesus, okay? This was a perfect way to segue into this episode because what it does, it gives you an example for you to be able to look at really how temptation comes at us, okay? And what better example to use for how to navigate through temptation than the very, 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 very accurate depiction of what happened to our Savior, the Most High Christ, Yahweh, okay? And how he was able to handle temptation, which gives us an example in a blueprint. So a lot of times what I see clinically, it matches up with what I see in God's word, and it works. It works. So even if the whole religion, theology, divinity thing isn't your thing, that's cool. That's cool. The way that God has given it to me is a gift to present it. Even if you want to take the divinity and all that out of it, that's your choice. But it still works. These concepts still work. Now me, if you want that 1-2 punch, put it together. I've seen it work over the entire span of my career. I just believe in it. So, but I also understand, like Paul said, be all things to all men. So if it's not your thing, try it, it'll work. But I just believe that it has more potency when you take that sacred and then you put the secular with it, okay? Now I want to be clear. By blending the sacred and the secular, I'm not saying water down God's word, because that's not what I do. What I do is I use the sacred and I'm able to formulate a theory, a paradigm, and a approach that actually works. It's evidence-based with my population. So a lot of my population, they like and prefer there to be a spiritual component integrated with their treatment, and it works. So if it's not your thing, again, cool, but that 1-2 punch and that potency just comes when you just allow God's word to literally set the foundation, and that's what we did, and that's what we do here. Okay, so let's get right into this part right here. We're talking about the psychology of temptation. Now that we got etymology, definition, and occurrences and backdrop out the way, I want to go ahead and dive into this part. This is probably my favorite part of the series, because what we're talking about here is the how and when temptation occurs. The how and when. Now, using this biblical backdrop, again, you can go check it, Matthew chapter 4, verses 1-12. The thing that spoke to me and that speaks to my population whenever we do therapy on this particular dynamic of temptation and what happens when you yield to it or how it presents itself, I always say this, and I want to preface this before we even get started. Isolation plus deprivation is what equals temptation, okay? I'm going to run it back for you, okay? Isolation plus deprivation equals temptation, okay? So I want that to be resonating in your mind and taking root in your spirit, because I'm going to show you how this works by looking at what the Most High Christ did and how he was able to navigate it, and how Satan, the enemy, came at him, and how it really manifests itself when it comes to our temptations, okay? And how we are able to experience temptations but overcome them, okay? So when you go back and look at the whole backdrop of the story in Matthew 4, chapter 4, verses 1-12, and it talks about the temptation of Jesus, the first part that I want to break down is the first part, which is the isolation part. But this is what I call led into the wilderness, okay? This is the first part, led into the wilderness. Now, if you go back and read the story, and it's not a long story, so you can go back and read it and get the concept of what I'm saying. Right after Christ was confirmed by God, when God said, "This is my son, with whom I am well pleased," right after Christ actually had been baptized by John the Baptist, and God said, "This is my son, with whom I'm well pleased," and it says, and he was led into the wilderness. So here's where the temptation starts, okay? Led into the wilderness is isolation. So isolation is how temptation even starts, okay? Isolation. Now, most of the time when people yield to temptation, think about it. If we're being honest with ourselves, we're never really around a bunch of people when we yield to temptation. It's oftentimes when we're secluded and we're by ourselves. At least this is what I've heard in the therapy sessions that I've had. Unfortunately, again, having seen this more often in relationships when people are processing, why was infidelity committed, or why did cheating occur? And most of the time it was because they were isolated. They were alone. They were either alone with the individual, alone with their thoughts, or alone with their pain, okay? So when we talk about being led into the wilderness, as it referenced in Matthew 4, verses 1-12, this is when temptation often enters, is when we're isolated. And I want to give you the definition that I have for isolation so that we can have that operational definition in terms of this and how it plays a role in temptation being presented and even yielded to. So when we talk about temptation, per definition, our definition for isolation is the condition of being alone, especially when it makes you feel unhappy. I really, really, really was digging this definition when it came across, because it was that part that made me say, that's it right there. Because when you talk about isolation, It's not about being alone. It's about when you feel unhappy, okay? I'm gonna let that marinate for a minute because that thing was so powerful because I've seen it so often in my therapy sessions with my patient population. Because oftentimes what would come up and be processed is that the mate would say, well, you have a problem being alone, that's why you went out and cheated. No, the issue wasn't necessarily the person being alone, it was the person being alone and unhappy, okay? Now, there's nothing wrong with being alone, being by yourself. I think that's good, that's therapeutic to be alone with your thoughts, to be alone with God. You know, the Bible promotes that. I promote that as far as, self-awareness and self-heightening and self-enlightenment. You know, being alone isn't anything wrong with that. But it's when we're alone and we're unhappy that here is temptation presenting itself, okay? Now, oftentimes what tends to happen is the occurrences of isolation is what tends to be the breeding ground for temptation to even begin, okay? And as I did in the previous episode, I went back and I looked at the case studies, the notes from previous patients, my documentation that I've kept, and just remembering certain sessions that stood out to me and what were the themes that I saw that came from isolation that yielded temptation, okay? So again, keep in mind before we even talk about the examples of isolation, that isolation is the condition of being alone, especially when it makes you feel unhappy, okay? Keep that in mind. I want you to keep rotating that definition in your mind because that's going to be pivotal for you to understand how isolation plays a role in the yielding of temptation, in the yielding to temptation, okay?
Why do you believe that so many women are going into entrepreneurship, and why did you go into it?
Because it's necessary. That's what we do. We make ways out of no ways.
For me, I went into it because I had reached a certain level when I was in corporate America where I couldn't go any further.
When you look at corporate America, we're disenfranchised. We're always at the bottom of the totem pole. We're constantly having to be on and work on eggshells. That's not fulfillment for everyone.
Hey, boss. Okay.
I said I'm fine.
Me to bed, see you in the morning. With the frosted Superman, but it wasn't on it. And we lost it.
You can talk to me.
It's been really, really hard for me.
One of Dr. Gino's strengths in his preaching to me is his ability to situate the listener.
Transition is hard. In fact, I dare say that it's one of the most difficult things to do. And I mean, in a real sense, it is so hard that in one it produces fear.
You pick an image that we all can relate to. What do you love most about your practice of African American preaching? Go.
My practice of African American preaching is steeped in Zora Neale Hurston's Negro expression. When we sing a song, it's sung a lot differently. When we do a dance, it's done a lot differently. When we preach a sermon, it's done a lot differently because we take it through our struggle and we adorn it and beautify it. And we've had to dare to find God and mine hope so that we might be able to know that the trouble that we go through doesn't last always.
So some of the examples of isolation, and I just want you to think about, your own life dynamic. Like when you come here to Sound Mind, I want you to be able to grow and I want you to be able to expand. I really want you to do what I call the work, okay? Do the work that comes with looking at self and looking at your life dynamics, and what you're guaranteed to see is certain patterns that you can improve upon only if you're willing to do the work. Okay, the benefit of having this platform, because it is a recorded, televised dynamic, it's only you and yourself and the Most High God when you're watching this. So if you put in the work and you ask those questions, I hope it leads you to some insight, but I hope even more that it leads you to go and get a therapist of your own, where you could take this process with your therapist and really get to some of the origins and the roots of some of the things you feel like you may have yielded to, or even to help you understand maybe somebody that yielded to a temptation that caused you to not be in relationship with them any further, just to give you some understanding. Now, I'm not saying go back to them, because that's one thing that the good doctor doesn't promote. I don't promote going backwards to anything that we've been freed from, but it does help you get some insight in terms of things that happen, so you just kind of know what to look out for and what not to contribute to in your own relationships, okay? So when we talk about the occurrences and the examples that I've seen clinically of isolation, the biggest one that I saw was affection. When people feel isolated in their affection, it makes them unhappy, okay? One of the things that I really want us to get away from in our relationships is when we say to a person that says that, you know, well, they're a touchy-feely person, well, that's just not me, that's not how I was brought up, that's just how I am. Let me please push back against that. You are not just this product of just life and this product of genetics and products of biology and the products of sociology and the products of environment. You're not just that. You choose who you want to be, okay? So one of the greatest acts of love that we can show that prevents people from feeling isolated from an affection regard is being able to absorb what's important to them and just be able to reciprocate it to them, okay? So even if you weren't hugged growing up, if the person you love is affectionate, what's wrong with being more affectionate? What's wrong with it? Okay, so don't give that excuse of, well, that's just not me. That's who you choose not to be. And when the person that you love, particularly to my married people, people in relationship, if you have children, if they want to hug you, don't push back on that, because at that point you've isolated them. And now it makes them feel a sense of rejection. So now temptations have a greater leeway and influence because they've been isolated in affection, okay? So don't be so rigid and so self-absorbed to the point that if somebody that you love says that this is something that that they value and it's important to them, just learn it. Just learn it. As long as it's within reason. Now, don't be doing anything crazy for somebody in the name of love and then saying, well, Dr. Winfrey said, no, that's not what Dr. Winfrey said. But in this aspect, if you're talking about somebody that you love, and we're talking about affection in this case, which is the area of one of the most isolated instances of demonstrations that lead to isolation, just be more mindful of that, okay? Now, also in isolation comes from another occurrence of isolation that I've seen in my practice was the isolation of thoughts, okay? When people feel as if they can't share their thoughts, it makes them unhappy. I hear this so often in my practice when men come to me particularly. Women come to me as well, but I'm grateful to have a large population of men that come to me, but I hear the same thing, be it male or female. I can't share my thoughts. If I say something, then it's gonna be an argument. They say they wanna know what's on my mind, but then when I tell them it's pushback and all that, that isolates a person, okay? It isolates a person, which again gives leverage to temptation when people feel alone with their thoughts and they're unhappy about it, okay? So I hope that we're in self-relationships and romantic and family-based relationships, all of our relationships, professional relationships, where we should be able to share our thoughts, that our thoughts aren't being isolated, because then it leverages temptation, okay? Another area of isolation is in support. Some people feel as if they have been denied the ability to have support, and so it isolates them. Now, this one's a little tricky because sometimes people feel like, well, if you don't go along with what I want you to, if it's a ridiculous idea, say, hey, let's spend the mortgage payment on getting some old school cars. No, I'm not saying go and support that, because you have a liveliness and a livelihood that you need to be able to provide for. So don't run out here and do something, ridiculous that's going to compromise your quality of life. So don't go out here and do something in that capacity and say, well, it was my way of supporting them because I didn't want them to feel isolated. No, that's not what I'm saying. Basically, supporting someone in a way that is productive for their life and well-being prevents them from going into a period in a space of feeling isolated, okay? So that's important in that aspect, okay? And this one's important too. Another occurrence where isolation tends to manifest itself and leads to the possible yielding of temptation, when people feel as if presence is isolated. Okay, so what does that mean with a presence being isolated? Basically, not just sharing a place with a person, but sharing an intimate space. A lot of times, what I hear in therapy is how people will be in the same house and have very little engagement, okay? And as a result, what ends up happening is people feel isolated. And again, have a large percentage of my population that are couples. And one of the things that I do is I'll see my couples together. And then what I do is I spin them off one-on-one so I can really hear what's really on their heart and mind that they don't feel comfortable enough saying in the presence of each other. And oftentimes males and females talk about how they feel isolated in presence, how they could be sitting right next to the person and they might as well be on the other side of the country because they're engaged with other things, you know, watching the game or being on social media, being on their phones. And so they don't share the presence together. Particularly for my married couples. If you have children, I say this all the time, and being transparent, I promote this in my own marriage. You have to make sure that your presence as husband and wife is fed into and that it's nurtured, because that helps you feed and nurture your responsibilities as parents. But a lot of times what ends up happening is you isolate your husband and wife time and presence, and it ends up impacting your intimacy and closeness as a couple. And so when the children are gone, guess what? You don't really know each other because you allowed that presence to be compromised, okay? And so we want to make sure, particularly in a couple dynamic and a married dynamic, please make sure that you're spending that intimate time that's needed to nurture and cultivate your marital responsibilities to one another. The kids don't come first. That's out of order. Or as I say in my practice to my couples, you're out of alignment, okay? It's husband, wife, then children. Not husband, children, then wife. Not wife, children, then husband. It's Christ, husband, wife, children. And let your children know that too. Because when children see things out of alignment, when they see you all isolating that part of the alignment, what ends up happening is it gives them a misinterpretation of how God meant for the flow to be, okay? So 9 times out of 10, a lot of times in my marriage couple sessions, I can tell the problem based on the alignment, and a lot of times our marriages and our families are out of alignment. So I just want to put y'all up on game when it comes to that, because I love you and I want your marriages and your relationships to thrive, and I don't want anybody to feel isolated, particularly when it comes to presence, okay? So these are the 4 most common occurrences that I saw when it came to my practice, when it came to isolation. People feel isolated with affection, they feel isolated in thoughts, they feel isolated with support, and they feel isolated in presence, okay? So remember, isolation, it wasn't just a matter of being alone, it was also a matter of when it makes people be unhappy, okay? When people feel unhappy. So that's always that X factor, just to be considerate, putting y'all up on game, okay? So I want you to understand this is how temptation tends to usher itself in, is because there is isolation. It's when alone and unhappy comes together. And so now temptation can yield leverage, okay? Because people feel isolated, okay? So let's work on that. So going back to the backdrop as far as Jesus, when he was led into the wilderness, he was isolated, okay? So there wasn't any support around him. He was alone. So that's the first part of temptation, is isolation, okay? Now, the second part of temptation and how it is yielded is what I call after he was fasted and was hungry, okay? So if you know the backdrop of the story, hopefully you've at least opened up your Bible, or at least researched it enough to this point to know the backdrop. Jesus was led into the wilderness, then he fasted immediately. So he fasted first. So he hadn't had anything to eat for an extended period of time. So he fasted and was hungry, okay? So the second part, after you have isolation, which is your how temptation comes, when does it come? When you're experiencing deprivation, okay? Deprivation is the when temptation tends to occur, all right? So for our definition of deprivation, here's what it is that we have, okay? Here's what I was able to find after doing extensive research. Deprivation is defined as the lack or denial of something considered to be needed and necessary. I really, really like that definition because it spoke volumes of what I hear so often in my practice when couples come, when individuals come and we're trying to process, why certain things happen, why did they yield to temptation? Deprivation, it was something that they were going without, okay? One of the things that I tell my patient population is this. As a practitioner, I will never ask one of my patients to give up something unless I have something to give them in return. And I think that's a good practice we should have for our life and our relationships. If you're asking somebody that you love to give up something, okay, you have to give them something to put back in place, okay? Because other than that, you have a void, okay? There's an emptiness. There's an unoccupied space. And when there's an unoccupied space, there's idleness. And we all know what we hear so often in that cliche, an idle mind is the devil's playground, okay? So we don't want anything to be idle and for there to be a void. So just keep that in mind. If you're asking your children to not spend so much time on the game, what are you gonna give them in light of that, in lieu of that, okay? If you're telling your spouse not to be on social media so much, what are you gonna give them in light of that? What's gonna be the exchange, okay? All right, so you got to switch out with something. You just can't leave a space there in that regard, okay? So when we talk about deprivation, the lack or denial of something considered to be needed or necessary, the part that I really want to home in on is that part where it says the lack or denial of something.
When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. The main character is moving back home. She's going back and she's really just noticing how the neighborhood is changing. New neighbors are moving in, old neighbors that have historically been there are moving out. And so the book takes you on this journey of that overall process of gentrification.
Some history behind that is that this has actually been going on for years, where they actually will zone people out and they will put people in a particular area and they will pay them to actually stay in this area. Like, I want you to stay in this area. You can't move here in the suburbs where I live in, but I'm going to pay you to stay over here. And once you move, the payment actually stops.
Well, for me, when I hear gentrification, I automatically think of greed, because that's really what it boils down to.
Where did the time go? I don't know how I got here.
You've done the hard part. You quit smoking. Now do the easy part and get scanned for lung cancer. If you smoked, you may still be at risk, but early detection could save your life. Talk to your doctor and learn more at savedbythescan.org.
Guys, today we have a bone-in pork shoulder. And look, we're gonna be cooking that in our Instapot. So you guys got your Instapots ready? Let's cook.
Okay, when we think deprivation, we think lack, but sometimes we don't think about also denial, saying you can't have it, okay? And when you think about your relational dynamics, oftentimes what happens is we see ourselves lacking something, or when we just are straight up denied something, okay? When you're denied something, it makes you feel rejected, and when you feel rejected, now it opens up the propensity for us to look towards other things to fill that place of rejection, okay? So here's what makes temptation even more powerful, because we're lacking something and we're being denied it, and it's necessary, okay? It's the reason why it was necessary. Now, tying it back to Christ and what he had been experiencing, he hadn't eaten for a significant amount of time, so he was hungry, okay? So there was a deprivation that was entering because there was a lack of something that he needed. We need food, okay? Now, one of the things that I like to say in therapy, and I say this to my males and females, in relationships particularly, you want to make very certain that your spouse, your mate, anyone that you love, you want to be sure that you never allow them to get hungry. Because a hungry person will eat anything that's put in front of them. So in that context, we want to make certain that we're feeding those that we love with the things that they need on a consistent basis, okay? Because we never want the people that we love to go hungry because they're liable to eat anything. And we're liable to eat anything. That's why it's important for us to have that manifestation of the word and how we can feed ourselves and make sure our relationships are feeding us as well, okay? So, some of the examples and the occurrences that came to my mind when I did my research of my own population, the two most common examples of occurrences of deprivation, time and attention. Time and attention were the two most common areas where I saw deprivation have a major impact on individual relationships and other aspects of people's lives, okay? So we want to make certain that when it comes to deprivation that we're understanding the when and we're understanding the how, okay? So let's do a quick recap. Isolation is what occurs first, okay? When a person is isolated, it's what is how the how of temptation is ushered in. Temptation is ushered in when there's also deprivation. So here's my correlation and here's my theory, okay, that I'm giving you all. Basically, isolation contributes to deprivation. Deprivation, in turn, contributes to isolation. And together and combined, when isolation meets deprivation, now it equals temptation, okay? You remember our definition from episode 1 for season 7 was the considering of doing something wrong or unwise, okay? So that's where it comes from, the considering of doing something wrong and unwise, okay? So that's important for us to keep in mind when you talk about temptation, is understanding, again, we touched on the etymology, definition, the occurrences of temptation, and we just broke down how and when temptation comes. Remember, temptation comes how? Through isolation. When? When we're experiencing deprivation. So when isolation meets deprivation, now we have temptation, okay? So that's what was the backdrop for Jesus in the temptation that he experienced. He was isolated because he had been led into the wilderness, okay, isolation, and he had fasted for an extended period of time, so he was hungry. He had been deprived of food, or he chose to deprive himself of food. So as a result, now you have deprivation, which now means temptation is even more likely and strong because of the very fact that it is a combination of these two dynamics of isolation and deprivation, okay? So what I want you all to take into consideration is, where do we feel isolated at? Where do you feel isolated? And be honest with yourself, okay? Do you feel isolated at work, isolated at school, isolated in your relationship, okay? And be honest and have those conversations with God, and hopefully have those conversations with the people in which you feel you are isolated from. What are you being deprived? Be honest. What is that thing in my life that I'm going without that I need and that's necessary? Have that conversation with yourself and God, but then also have that conversation with the people that you love. Say, hey, I need more time with you, okay? I need more date nights. I just need more, and being able to say what it is. Don't just say I need more and you can't tell anybody what it is. Going to your supervisor at work and say, hey, I need an increase. Well, what do you want particularly? You gotta be specific so that people can hear what your needs are and then make a conscious decision either to embrace them or to reject them in that context, okay? So we wanna make sure that we're pulling that together, okay? So this is what we went over in episode 2. Okay, this is part 2. There's gonna be a part 3, because this is deep and I wanna make sure that you get it, okay? Of the psychology of temptation. So what we went over today was the how and the when and the correlation of temptation, okay? So in the backdrop, again, going from Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, the incident of Christ being led into the wilderness after he fasted and he was hungry. So that's important. He had fasted and he was hungry. So it wasn't just that he hadn't had anything to eat, but he knew he hadn't had anything to eat, and as a result, he was hungry. And how do we address that, not just in our relationships, not just in our mental health, but also in our relational health as well, okay? So there's gonna be a part 3 because again, I promised in this season, I'm gonna take my time with it so you can get it because I don't want it to be rushed, okay? So we're gonna be back in the next episode, part 3, and then we're gonna pull it all together in part 3. We're gonna knock it out the park, okay? So as always, thank you so much for tuning in. I love y'all, I love you, I love you. Thank you so much for the support. Y'all are the absolute best. Thank you so much for what you do for Sound Mind and all of the quality program here on Hope TV. And as always, you know how we do about this time. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May he turn his loving smile and countenance towards you, blessing you in your going outs and your coming ins. And may he give thee shalom peace. Jay Gideon Winfrey, licensed therapist. This has been another episode of Sound Mind, and tune in for part 3 of the Psychology of Temptation for our next episode, where we're going to bring it all together and be able to help us understand and how to withhold ourselves from succumbing to the psychology of temptation, okay? So we will see y'all next time. Thank you so much. Love you. May the Lord watch between you and me while we are away from one another. Love y'all. Take care. See you next time.
Thank you.